The phone lines went dead in his compound at dawn. Gaddafi's final audio message crackled across state radio, still commanding, still convinced of victory. His voice carried the weight of 42 years of absolute power, a man who'd never heard the word no without consequences. But the man issuing orders from a bunker in Sirte was no longer controlling anything. NATO jets circled overhead. His convoy was spotted fleeing the city as dawn broke. Loyalist forces were collapsing in real time. The man who'd ruled Libya since 1969, who'd styled himself as the King of Kings of Africa, was now hunted in his own capital. Rewind 72 hours. He still believed he could win. The trap that closed on Gaddafi wasn't built in the final days of October 2011. It was constructed over decades, a series of miscalculations that a dictator surrounded by yes-men could never see coming. In 2003, Gaddafi made what he believed was a strategic masterstroke. He abandoned Libya's nuclear weapons program. He opened the country to Western investment. He believed he was buying insurance, that by disarming himself, he'd earn protection from the international community. The logic seemed sound to him. A leader who cooperates gets rewarded. A leader who threatens gets isolated. So he chose cooperation. 8 years later, that calculation became a death sentence. By October 2011, NATO had already flown over 26,000 sorties across Libya. The alliance had transformed what started as a humanitarian intervention to protect civilians into a full-scale regime change operation. Gaddafi's military was fractured. His air force was grounded. His armor was being systematically destroyed from the sky. But his inner circle was still feeding him false reports of victory. This is the dictator's trap. Power is a closed loop. When a leader eliminates dissent, they also eliminate truth. The only information reaching Gaddafi was information his subordinates wanted him to hear. Regional commanders exaggerated their strength. Loyalist units reported victories that never happened. The tribal structure of his military meant there was no unified command, just competing power centers, each telling their leader what he wanted to hear. Gaddafi believed reinforcements were coming from the south. Intelligence reports suggested massive loyalist forces were mobilizing to relieve Sirte. The reality was different. Those reinforcements had either been defeated weeks earlier, defected to the rebels, or existed only in rebel propaganda designed to demoralize the regime. But Gaddafi didn't know that. His intelligence apparatus had collapsed. His surveillance networks were being systematically destroyed by NATO strikes on command centers. His sons and closest advisors were debating evacuation. Muammar urged his father to leave the city. Security officials whispered about escape routes to the south, toward Niger. But Gaddafi refused. Sirte was his hometown. It was the symbolic heart of his regime. Abandoning it meant admitting defeat. And a man who'd never admitted weakness in 42 years of rule couldn't start now. So he stayed. He recorded more audio messages. He issued orders as if he still controlled the country. He spoke of counteroffensives that would never materialize. He invoked tribal loyalty and revolutionary fervor. The broadcasts played across state media to an audience that was no longer listening. What Gaddafi didn't understand, what his isolation prevented him from understanding, was that the outcome had already been decided. Not by him, not by his military, by NATO command centers in Naples and Brussels, by intelligence analysts in Washington and London who'd already begun planning the post-Gaddafi transition, by foreign ministers who'd already divvied up Libya's oil contracts and strategic positioning. The Western narrative was humanitarian intervention. Protect civilians. Stop a dictator from massacring his own people. The reality was geopolitical calculation. Gaddafi had become unpredictable. He was strengthening ties with China and Russia. He was accumulating gold reserves and planning an African currency that would bypass Western financial systems. He was a threat not because he was committing atrocities, the region had seen worse and received no intervention, but because he was no longer useful to the West. The trap was closing, and Gaddafi was still convinced he could escape. Sirte's defenders were running out of ammunition. The city's perimeter was shrinking by the hour. Rebel forces, equipped with NATO weapons and guided by NATO surveillance, were tightening the noose around the last major regime stronghold. Gaddafi made his final coherent decision. He would stay in Sirte, rather than flee to the desert. His reasoning was rooted in ego. Abandoning his hometown meant admitting the system had failed. It meant acknowledging that the revolution he'd launched in 1969 was finished. A man of his stature didn't flee. He fought, he resisted, he died in place if necessary. The military situation was deteriorating faster than his inner circle could process. Communication between units had broken down. Commanders didn't know if orders were coming from the regime or from rogue actors trying to save themselves. The chain of command had fractured into isolated pockets of resistance. Some officers were already negotiating with intermediaries about their own survival. Others were preparing to disappear into the population. Mu'tasim was still in the compound with his father, urging resistance. But even he knew the end was near. His security chief was already having quiet conversations with people who might be able to help him escape. The inner circle was splintering. NATO surveillance tracked every movement. Satellites mapped every street. Drone feeds showed rebel positions in real time. Every escape route was known. Every defensive position was targeted. The regime had no secrets left. Gaddafi recorded more messages, defiant, theatrical, completely detached from the military reality collapsing around him. He spoke of victory as if the city wasn't burning. He invoked the people as if they hadn't already abandoned him. He issued orders to commanders who were no longer listening. By this point, even loyalist fighters knew the outcome. Some were already planning their exits. Some were preparing to surrender. Some were simply waiting for the end. The Western powers had already begun their post-conflict planning. The outcome was predetermined from a geopolitical standpoint. The only variable left was how messy the final collapse would be. October 20th, 2011. Dawn broke over Sirte. Gaddafi's convoy attempted to break through rebel lines heading south toward the desert. He believed a safe corridor existed. Intelligence had told him one was there. It wasn't. NATO jets struck the convoy. The vehicles scattered. Gaddafi and his security detail were forced into the streets on foot. A man who'd spent 42 years insulated from direct danger was suddenly exposed. No bunker, no guards, no command structure, just survival. He ended up in a drainage pipe in a residential area of Sirte, not by strategic design, by accident, by the simple chaos of a military collapse. Loyalist fighters made a final stand around him, maybe a dozen men, poorly armed, overwhelmed within hours. They were killed or captured, the perimeter closed. His last communications were still issuing orders, still convinced reinforcements were coming, still operating under the delusion that the system he'd built could absorb this blow. The gap between what he believed and what was actually happening had become absolute. When the rebels found him, they recognized him immediately. The moment of capture was chaotic and violent. There was no trial, no international court, no legal proceeding. The cycle of violence that had defined his rule ended in extrajudicial killing. A man who'd spent decades crushing dissent was crushed by the forces he'd underestimated. The Western powers maintained strategic silence on the manner of his death. They'd achieved their objective. A regime change had been accomplished. A leader had been removed. The legal complications of a formal trial, the messy questions about due process and international law, those could be avoided entirely. The outcome was what mattered. The method was secondary. Within hours, his body was displayed. Within days, the narrative was set. A dictator had fallen. Libya was free. The humanitarian intervention had succeeded. The reality was different. Libya fractured immediately. No unified government emerged. No functioning institutions replaced the ones that had collapsed. The power vacuum that NATO had created was filled by competing militias, tribal factions, and foreign actors with their own agendas. Russia moved in. Turkey moved in. The UAE moved in. Wagner mercenaries arrived. Each power filled the void left by Western intervention and Western abandonment. A decade later, Libya remains a failed state. Two competing governments. No central authority. Thousands dead in the civil war that followed. Millions displaced. His death didn't bring stability. It accelerated state collapse. The lesson was absorbed by every other autocracy watching. Disarming yourself. Cooperating with the West, believing in the system. These are paths to execution. Modern dictators learned from Libya. They concluded that negotiating with the West is suicide. They doubled down on weapons programs. They strengthened alliances with rivals of the West. What changed? Libya went from a functioning state to a failed state. What didn't change? The pattern of intervention followed by abandonment. The geopolitical calculation that treats regime change as a solution when it's actually the creation of chaos.